Comment allez-vous? Yeah? Well, I'm happy to be here on this beautiful ship again, going to a beautiful country, and I'm going to give you a little more introduction to our ports of call. By way of introduction, I'm a U.S. Merchant Marine officer, and I've been sailing around the world most of my life. I actually have a tall ship license from the U.S. Coast Guard, so I'm usually on sail vessels. So I'm having a hard time getting used to the ease of this ship, though if you think the clocks are off on this great ship, you should work on a sailboat where time becomes, as they say, Dali-esque, and we don't quite know when we're going to arrive. But this particular part of the world where we are in the Bay of Biscay is famous among sailors in the past times for being very rough water. And even though it's pretty calm out there now, particularly the winter, this is a storm-lashed coast, and I'll show you some pictures of the cliffs that are eroding. They're great beaches, but almost all of the towns and villages are up the rivers and inland because the shore is so difficult most of the year. And typically you have the strong North Atlantic winds coming with great waves. And if you heard the captain's announcement earlier this morning, we will be having some of the swells coming that'll well, it's good for sleeping, actually. It's not good for walking, but it's, let's say, a dream machine if you're comfortable enough on a ship in that kind of sea state. And then we'll be going down into the river of the Gironde to go to Bordeaux. So there is shelter. Then we'll end up going all the way around Cape Finisterre into Portugal. So this is a very dramatic coast, but it is, of course, best known for its wine and food and, let's say, the pleasures of France and Portugal and Spain. So I'm going to show you a bit about the area. We are coming down, that's actually the great beach at Saint-Jean-de-Luz. But here's Gironde, Aquitaine, Lagont, the province bordering Spain. And so this is sort of the great southwest of France. It is the least populated part of France, the least industrialized, and so it has become a place where French and other people, of course, come to vacation from the busier north and the cold weather that you could feel a little bit out of Saint-Malo. But in history, it has the unique quality of having been shared and fought over for centuries by England and France. And the 100 Years' War devastated much of this region. Back in the medieval times, this had been a province of England. And so the crests of, this is the province of Aquitaine, it has the British lion and the fleur-de-lis. And then even the city of Bordeaux has both the lion and the fleur-de-lis, and also the chateau of the Dukes of Aquitaine. Now this region goes back into prehistory with Celtic peoples, and these are coins that were minted about 200 BC, and it's sort of a Greek model, but it was actually a Celtic people who founded the city of Bordeaux. And in Latin, they were called the Burdigala, and that's where the name Bordeaux and this Burgundy, these are names that go back into pre-Roman times. And there had been invasions, because it's a flat land, it was very easy for let's say the Visigoths and even the Saracens and other armies to come up the coast because it's flat land and readily accessible. So this is an area that also built tremendous castles like we've seen in other parts of Europe, certainly. The most famous resident of this region, though, was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the wealthiest and wisest woman in the Middle Ages in the 12th century. Now she was born in Bordeaux and inherited at the age of 5 all of the lands of her family. And curiously, she was her brother had died, therefore it reverted to her even as a child. But as she grew up, she was very well educated, very lively, very diplomatic, and literate, which was not often the case with women of that era. But she managed her great estates, which included about 1/3 of France at the time, to negotiate marriages. And so she first married Louis VII of France, and this then combined their lands. And she was also a very devout Christian, and so she encouraged Louis and her own army from Aquitaine to join the Second Crusade. She rode in horse and carriage all the way to Palestine and Antioch and battles in the Second Crusade. And it was said that she had her own contingent of women warriors that would protect her. And so this is the stuff of legend and also now movies, and you can read fuller biographies. But here she is setting out with the blessings of Pope Clement out to free the Holy Land from the infidels and vice versa. But she was caught in many a battle, including once the Turkish forces, as they were described back then, captured her luggage. And they had a battle, but they captured all of her personal clothing and the retinue that she had with her. And so some people said, well, you don't go to war carrying fine dining gowns and jewelry. Now let that be a lesson on this ship. But she made it back to France, and because she could not have a son, Louis VII filed for an annulment of the marriage. And the Pope gave the annulment on the basis that they were too closely related. Well, there was a lot of intermarriage in the royal families at the time, but what she did then is, in her fame at the time, she then sent a letter to King Henry II of England and asked him to marry her, and then combined Aquitaine with the English as a defense against other contending forces in France. And so they got married at this palace in Poitiers, which is still there. And then she had 5 sons and 3 daughters by Henry II. So she was, let's say, a busy lady, but she had her own court, and this was in Poitiers, at what's now the Palais de Justice there. She entertained many a literary figure and knights, and this became a center for what they call the courtly romantic love of the time. And this is the medieval chivalry, and often platonic love was encouraged. But of course other things went on. But she lived to have her sons become King of England. First of all, John, and then Richard I. Now you know the story of Robin Hood and all that. Well, she has a key place in that whole era. She ended up coming back to Aquitaine with Henry in their later years, and then they had difficulty, and Henry put her in a prison for 15 years. Now, that's not the way you're supposed to treat your wife just because she's entertaining other knights. But they came back together, and they buried together in this Fontevraud Abbey in Aquitaine, and it's quite a lovely portrait of her. She was very famous, but there's no good portrait of her. They don't really know what she looks like, but this portrait of her lying in state in the tomb is the best image we have of her. She had given this rock crystal vase to Henry II, and that ended up being given to an abbey, and now it's at the Louvre. And that's the only possession of her era that has remained into a museum. Well, that's great legend. You can probably buy the biographies on the streets of, or the latest edition of the tales on the streets of Bordeaux. But what we're going to do is come down the Gironde River and then all the way up through the countryside, and this fairly flat land with all the vineyards on either side, and then come up to the city of Bordeaux. Now, Bordeaux is considered one of the classic cities of France, very elegant, very broad, not industrialized. So it's a very pleasant city with a lot of classic buildings along the river, and all around it are all the different vineyards. Now, this view of just downtown, we will be docking right on the river above, to the north of the bridge that crosses the river, and the different museums and sites in the town. The cathedral where Eleanor was married, and then there's history museums and a variety of things to see in the city. But this city was essentially built upon wine, and since the Middle Ages, it has been the major production area in France. There's over 600 square miles of vineyards just within the Bordeaux region, the largest production center in all of France. This is a portrait of the waterfront painted by Monet in 1882. And it shows all the ships from all around the world are coming to pick up the wine, and especially take it to England. And to this day, the claret and the other light red wines and white wines are very popular in the UK and, of course, around the world. Well, what this did is meant the merchants of Bordeaux could build a magnificent city, which was more elegant than Paris in its day before Paris became the, let's say, the megalopolis that it is and has its attractions. But Bordeaux is a classic town without, let's say, the congestion of Paris. It doesn't even have that many immigrants. And so it's, let's say, a conservative part of France because it is based in the agricultural production of the area. This is Rue Sainte-Catherine, which is the main pedestrian road right through the center of town into the old part of town. This is the longest pedestrian shopping street in Europe, and a pleasure to walk through the town. Where we are docked, we can get right off and go walking right into town. This is the Column of the Girondins, which is the name of the region, Victory Monument, and then a grand plaza in the center of town, one of the largest in Europe. My picture didn't come up, but there's a medieval gate that enters into the old town where there used to be city walls, and then there are now a lot of churches. This is the Église Saint-Pierre, which is late Romanesque, and then an earlier one, which is the Church of Notre Dame of Bordeaux, which is a more medieval style without spires. And here's another view of Notre Dame. So it's more Rococo. Then you have a Grecian-style grand theater, which is the opera house for the city, but you can see the size of that. And even though Bordeaux in the city only has about 600,000 people, it still has these tremendous monuments and public spaces. This is the Pont de Pierre, which is the bridge across the Gironde, which was ordered to be built by Napoleon, and it's still an elegant sort of Parisian-style stone bridge across the river. Here again is Rue Sainte-Catherine, the shopping street. And then here's the Bourse, which is the exchange and trading center for particularly the wine, so that the finance of agriculture comes out of the Bourse. This is a night scene off the river, so it's spectacular at night. We will be there to see this. But the main reason why we're staying so long, of course, is to enjoy the countryside and go see the chateau and the vineyards. And so right on either bank of the Gironde, to the west is the Médoc Peninsula, which is a flat and dry area, but it is famed for the soil that gives the quality to the different appellations. And so this is a graph of the different terroir. I'm not a wine expert, so I leave that to your discussion with your sommelier or your own taste, but of course this is an area that, as they say, Bordeaux wine is the standard by which all others are measured in the world. And so we have from the North Médoc down to Marchaux, and then we have Sauternes down in the south. And so all of these wines that you can see here on board or in your local wine shop, they come from this region which has a kind of almost a rocky soil and a very warm and dry climate, and that's what produces these fine wines. So if you have not planned to go to one of these great chateaux, this is the thing to do here. And some of them are quite far away, a full day journey. Others are not far out of town. And they feature the chateau, which are not necessarily a castle. They're just the manor house of the families that run these great vineyards. So here's one, the Chateau Smith of Lafite, and they often typically will serve a lunch and then have a tasting or visit the vineyards. I'm sure you've all done this before, different places. Here's La Tour, because of the great tower they have built. Now most of these were built 1800s, and nowadays they are still expanding the production. Here's Margaux, and if you might have noticed in the ship's films, they have a film called the Red Obsession, which is the driving up of prices of Bordeaux wines by the competitive auctions of the finest and the rarest of wines by mainly Chinese buyers, and to the point where whole estates have been bought, first of all by the Japanese and now by the Chinese, to export this wine to Asia. And so even though the most famous houses are still, let's say, on French sponsorship as usual, some of this wine is in such demand that the top few years ago auction price for a rare Bordeaux wine was over $1 million US. And so this is where wine becomes almost a object of, let's say, ostentatiousness rather than actually drinking it. But you can still open a bottle of wine even if it costs $1 million. It's usually vinegar by then, of course. But this is the greatest of the house, Chateau Margaux. And then this other one is the Grand Barral Chateau. And so they all have their own labels and they all have their own specialty. And if you're a real connoisseur, you can go through and taste so many different subtle differences that sort of beyond an ordinary palate. I saw that there's an excursion to Saint-Emilion, which is to the east of Bordeaux and up into the foothills. Now this is particularly beautiful little village because it dates from the 13th century. They say they've been making wine there for over 2,000 years. And this local appellation is called, has many estates and then different names for the different wine. This one is the Grand Cru Classé of the Chateau Langluis. And then there are other white wines. And so the variety of the wines is actually quite diverse just because there are so many small producers and special wines that are produced at different times. Now, in the last few years, they've had a lot of difficulty because in 2011, they had unprecedented heat, which dropped the production almost by a third, and the vines were unyielding because of the temperature. So one of the worries of this whole area is that if the world is getting rapidly warmer, this whole area will become more of a desert than a wine country. And again, in that film, if you see it, if it's still playing on television, one of the Chinese state corporations has identified an area in Ningxia, western China, that has the same kind of soil as Bordeaux, and they're planning to make it the new wine region of China and then compete on the world scale and also satisfy the great thirst for wine in Asia. So we'll see. I mean, the French are very conservative and very proud of what they have, and they've had to, let's say, have patience with the wine production all over the world, in the New World, and in Australia and all kinds of places. But still, Bordeaux is considered the, let's say, the best of the best. And so you can enjoy it and try the varieties and when we're ashore, and there's plenty on board, of course. And every year they have in June what they call the Fête de Vin, which is the festival of wine. And so all of the experts come from all over the world and come and try out the new year's production. And so that's the time to come and, let's say, get the crowds of the wine lovers there. And so it flows quite generously at that time of year. But the first rule of drinking wine is always have something to eat with it. So here's the local tempanade, the olive oil sauce. And then, of course, a larger meal. Here's a fish and some ratatouille, which is the sort of spicy fried steamed vegetables. And so there's plenty of cuisine to go with this. A lot of Michelin rated restaurants, some of which are in the chateau. But it's a gastronomic pleasure to be in this area because everything is done so well. Now then we're going to go down the Bay of Biscay, and there's a very long stretch of beaches. I saw that there's also a tour to Arcachon, the Great Bay, which is a nature preserve with Europe's largest sand dunes. And it looks like something in the west coast of Australia, but it's very remote from many parts of France, but nonetheless, this whole area has become a vacation zone for the rest of France and the rest of the world, and many people retire down here because the climate is so nice and the food is so good and the costs are much less than, let's say, the Mediterranean coast of France, which is so overcrowded in many ways. But here we're going to be going down to past Bayonne, the capital of the Pyrenees province, here to Biarritz. That's the casino resort town, and then we are landing, you see right on the left side of the map here is Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is on a small river, and we can get in there. And again, this is a not that populated a region. And then right from there, you go up into the Pyrenees. Now, this great mountain chain goes right from the Atlantic over to the Mediterranean, and it gets higher as it goes inland, so that there are the ancient passages were always along the coast. And inland it gets so rugged that there's a very difficult transit traditionally. But there's also that famous pilgrimage trail called from San Sebastian up to San Juan de Compostela, the Spanish shrine. So there's a lot of hiking, including religious pilgrimages, still in those mountains right in this area. Now we are going to be coming into what is the Basque region. And this is a people that have been in this area for, they say, since primeval times, pre-Roman, pre-Indo-European languages. And it's a region that is both part of France and Spain, and as you know, they've had an independence movement since over 100 years ago, and had, let's say, battles especially with the Spanish government. And Franco, when the Spanish Civil War was concluded, he drove many of the Basques over the border into France. And so San Juan de Luz and Bayonne, all this area has a lot of Basque villages. Now it's at peace, but it's still an active issue in Spanish politics of whether the Basques will have either more autonomy from Madrid or will become their own independent nation. But San Juan de Cruz is not on this particular map. You see Bayonne, which is the capital of La Bourde province. And then you see in Spain you have Navarre, what they call Pampelune, is actually Pamplona in Spanish. And then you have Bilbao and San Sebastian. I'll be giving a talk about those places in 2 days. But this whole area is rugged country, and it has a very strong and proud people. Partly the coast is rough, and it's sort of lashed by particularly winter storms. And it had a lot of fishing industry and, let's say, maritime culture. Now, the old hand fishing from shore is pretty much replaced by industrial fishing, and the fish stocks have been depleted in this whole area. So that's another issue. But the villages are still there. And what's happened is it's become a holiday resort area. Now, this is in the Biarritz, which has large casinos and is a very let's say, ostentatious place and expensive. But then there's a lot of other little villages. Even San Juan de la Cruz is a smaller town and not, let's say, resorted into Club Meds and such. So, but here's the great beach at Saint-Jean-de-Luz. And these are, let's say, big sandy beaches that have been built up by the action of the water, and now this time of year they will be quite busy. You just saw in Saint-Malo how many tourists from the rest of France come to the shore this time of year. And my wife Barbara and I were just sitting there watching them all go by as an endless parade. Well, it'll be even more down here because this is warmer water and sunnier and even more popular down on this side of France. But in the town of Saint-Jean-de-Luz, it has some of these large palaces that were built when in 1660 Louis XIV had an arranged marriage with Maria Theresa of Austria. And so he chose this place because he liked the climate so much that he built his own palace and one for her. So then they had a large wedding, and this put this particular town on the map in history, and people have been coming back ever since. This is the Maison Infante, which was the princess. So she was put up here before they finally had their marriage in the Church of John the Baptist. And this is a very interesting church because it has sort of Romanesque arches, but then galleries and balconies within the church, so that at the wedding it was full of all of the nobility of France of the time. So again, 1660. And then otherwise it's a small town to walk around, and here's the mayor's office, government office. And then when you go outside of the town, you have Basque villages. And now this is sort of for those of us who are not, let's say, familiar with Basque culture, and I've had some Basque friends, and I would speak Spanish or French with them, but they do it reluctantly because they are mostly proud of their own language, which has been debated by scholars for centuries where this came from, whether it was related to Finnish, Hungarian, Uraltic, that's called that group of languages, or something that actually goes back even to Neanderthal times, because these are considered the most ancient indigenous people of Europe. Now, as I said, they've had a problem being controlled from Paris or from Madrid, and for many years there were terrorists called the ETA were bombing Spanish police stations and attacking, and this went on for many decades. Up till recently, they finally dropped their arms and their, let's say, armed resistance, and they have appealed to the European courts for autonomy or recognition as their own country. So the flag that they have is actually modeled after the British Union Jack, but it was declared in the 1880s this would be a nation, and so you'll hear it in the streets. They're speaking Euskadunak, which is a tongue twister, but that means that the name of their nation is actually the speakers of Basque. And so this is an inscrutable language to those of us who know mere, let's say, Romance or Germanic languages. But they have a lot of festivals and music and sports competitions, especially. And then there's a saying in Spain, you must have, for a soccer team, you must have a Basque goalie because they're very quick. And in a kitchen, in a restaurant, you must have a Basque chef because they are particularly fast and delicate in what they can make. So here there are some Basque in a restaurant making canapé. Here's a local dish which you may find on the bistros, on the cafes, which is the zurukutuna. Now, it's not on the menu here, but it's actually codfish, garlic, and egg soup, and sort of spicy. So there's a whole variety of food, of course, all through France and Europe, but this is one kind of cuisine that is now been distributed with Basque refugees or exiles around the world, including in the United States. I had around the corner where I live a Basque restaurant called Pintush, which is the Basque version of tapas, which are just little snacks that come out. And you have your wine and that's your meal. But the Basques are also famous for their sports. This is a highlight, which if you've ever seen this game, it's called the fastest game on earth because in every village they'll have a walled court called a fronton, and then they have these hooped, what would you call them, a kind of a scoop to throw a hard ball up to 150 kilometers an hour. So it's kind of a dangerous game. It's not rubber. It's a hard ball so that it bounces, kind of crashes off the walls, and then they are sort of like handball or squash. It's in a court like that. And there are large competitions of this, and again, it's around the world now. And then they have in the countryside what they call working competitions, sort of like Scottish games, where it's called Heri Kirolak, and they have wood chopping contests, stone carving contests, boat pulling contests, and a lot of, let's say, competitions made out of the agricultural or else maritime culture of this region. We'll have more of that. I'll talk more about it in my next talk in a couple of days. But I wanted to have a brief mention of some of the issues in France. Now, I don't know if any of you here are French or you've lived here or follow the news of France. This is a very proud country which has a very difficult time in what I call here the globalization, because 200 years ago the language of the European world was French. All the court spoke French. Even England used to speak French above the level of mere English. And so that when, let's say, the 20th century meant that English became the international language. And that's been very uncomfortable for the French. So even to now, they have difficulty to maintain their cultural identity when, there's a different culture, let's say. So as an example, I sent my older son to study. He was actually in Spain with an exchange program with a lot of other European teenagers. And he came back and he said the French were not very friendly because they kept saying, "You Americans have no culture." And I said, well, let me see. They, of course, have beautiful buildings, a great language, great food and all that, but what are your teenage friends doing? They're wearing blue jeans, drinking Coca-Cola, smoking American cigarettes, and listening to hip-hop. Is that French culture? Well, it's been in the global mixture of cultures, this is the way it is. So you find, particularly among the youth of France, now they all learn English, which was not unheard of in a previous century. Then I also mentioned that the difficulty of sovereignty in the European Union is a constant difficulty for many of the countries. Not having a unified foreign policy or even economic policy, you can read all about it, but for the French, they are very resistant to either the government telling them what to do, much less Brussels and the uncomfortable European Union starting to regulate agricultural policies, how they raise food, how they sell it, and all these different regulations that come out of Brussels. And then you can go to the sub-region like the Basque region or Languedoc or other parts of Europe where the local authorities appeal to Brussels over the head of their own national government for redress of grievances. Another thing I say is religion in a post-religious nation, because even though France is a largely Catholic nation, only a small fraction of people are actively religious, and the philosophical development of French thought has left Christianity as more of an ethical background and a cultural background than a fervent religious tradition these days. Even though some people may be going to Lourdes, the great Catholic shrine up in the Pyrenees, but that's being matched by the immigrants who come often with a very deep religious tradition, especially Islam has come into France like other parts of Europe, and it creates a distinct cultural difficulty, say. Then another thing that's part is, of course, the immigration and the assimilation of all the immigrants. So you can see it all around France, the rest of Europe. Now you have a multicultural society, and that, again, to the conservative cultures of Europe, and especially France, it is very difficult. And the issue in France has always been the legal requirement that you do not wear religious garb or religious symbolism, especially in the schools. So you can read about how the young girls are not allowed to wear a scarf. You cannot even wear a cross as a decoration in school. So that's a conflict that is simmering along. Then the problem of the economy, because France has had very slow growth, and it had a lot of letdown in the recession since 2008. But that has created a question of whether the social services that France provides, which is universal daycare, universal medical care, free university, pensions, and all these things that the social policies of France cannot be supported by an economy which is not growing, even though the population continues to grow. You saw all those families out there. I've had French friends who say, I'll never leave France because the benefits are so good. But then they often don't have a job either. So that's a major question. Then I also write there the la douceur de vivre continues. So even if there are problems here, the quality of life in France is considered one of the best in the world. Not just the social policies, but again, the food and then the wine. And so you know that there's terrorism in this country, and now we're in places that have fortunately been free of any of that. It's mostly in the major cities, and I took this picture on the walls of En Fleurs, Je suis Charlie. Now that refers to this magazine, the Charlie Hebdo, which is the satirical and often provocative magazine. Anybody wants to see it, I will show you. I would have taken a picture and showed you more, but most of them are actually fairly crude and very insulting. And so in this particular issue, they're making fun of every religion and anybody they can get within their pen's range. And so that but that's no justification for the massacre that happened at that magazine office in Paris. So all over France and around the world, the Je suis Charlie, I am one with this magazine for freedom of expression, although I don't think it's worth the €3 I paid for it myself. And then I have another, if you have interest in other French journals, here's the Libération, which is discussing politics and stuff, and so it's it's a very lively debate in France about all these things, to the point of summertime fun in Paris and other cities, where this was actually the demonstration of the taxi drivers against the Uber application. And so it's sort of a tradition, especially in Paris, that in the summer and spring well, in the spring the students riot, in the summer the workers riot, and so everybody takes August off so that they can go to the beach and get over it. But this is the man on the hot seat, President Hollande, who elected as a socialist, but he's sort of trying to manage this contentious country. And of course, when it's too much for him, he goes off on his scooter and visits his girlfriend. If you've seen that in the paper, he wore a helmet so nobody knew the president took the afternoon off. He was supposed to be at a meeting. And here's another issue that just came up, which is the French Navy and the shipyard built 2 large assault vessels under contract with the Russians. And after the Crimea incident, the NATO and then the French government decided that they would not arm the Russians with an advanced warship. So now France just announced they're going to give the Russians back their $2 billion, or how many euros that is, and then find another buyer for these advanced ships. Anybody like your own cruise ship? It's at a discount. And Mistral dans le vent, that means the deal is in the wind, and the Mistral is the wind onto the Mediterranean. Now, another just nautical curiosity is that I was just sailing my own vessel out in Greenport, Long Island in New York, and this coincided with the tour of this ship. Well, it was a tall ship gathering. Behind it is actually the Sagres, the Portuguese Navy tall ship, training ship. But you see it's a 1780s style reproduction of the frigate that General Lafayette brought over to aid the American Revolution. And so this is a reconstruction that was built in Roquefort, up in the Bay of Biscay, and all volunteer, no government money went in. For 17 years they put it together, and then they sailed across the Atlantic, and now they're on tour to commemorate the 250th visit of the Marquis de Lafayette, who came with the French fleet and bottled up the British at Cornwallis, General Cornwallis in Virginia, and then ended the American Revolution by the French blockade of the relief of the British troops. And so this is an example of historic cooperation between the United States and France. And so it had its tour up the East Coast, and now it's on its way back to France. But it's quite a fantastic construction, and a lumbering vessel of 48 guns, and pronouncing the virtues of liberty and equality and such. But the question is now, had Lafayette not insisted to the king that they join the American Revolution on the side of the rebels, what would have happened? Well, I think we'd all be Canadians. What could be better, right? Well, anyway, I'm going to leave with, again, a bit of graffiti I found on the streets of, this was in Saint-Malo, which I'll spare you my French accent, but it means, liberty, liberty. What have you done for liberty, for those who would defend you? With a rose in your hat, far more pretty than a flag, nothing has changed in their heart. They are not cold nor afraid. It is always your liberty that is their sun. So this is where France has a very strong feeling of personal, individual freedoms and responsibilities, of course, but and a nation that encourages the development of people's, not just their pleasures, but their intellect and their education and their tolerance of others. And so that's the great challenge of France these days. And where we are going is one of the more pleasant parts of France to see that. And I'll leave you with one last saying of the Claude Baudelaire, "A free man, you will always cherish the sea." And I hope you understand that and cherish our voyage together in France. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Okay. Be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. No? All right, thank you.